Amusement parks today are places of joy, color, and controlled thrills, carefully engineered fun where safety is paramount and fantasy is king. But rewind to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and you'll find something quite different. Early amusement parks were raw, chaotic, and sometimes truly terrifying, not just because of their rides, but because of the bizarre, dangerous, and even morally questionable experiences they offered. These weren't simply places for family outings or Instagrammable memories. They were gritty showcases of human curiosity, industrial power, and social rebellion. For many, they were thrilling. For others, they were nightmares in motion. It all began during the Industrial Revolution, when urbanization, electricity, and expanding middle-class leisure time collided. People flocked to cities to work in factories, and for the first time, they also had time off and a little extra money to spend. Entrepreneurs saw an opportunity to entertain the masses, and thus, the modern amusement park was born. But entertainment then wasn't just roller coasters and cotton candy. It was sideshows, freak shows, animal acts, and death-defying stunts, from Coney Island in New York to Blackpool in England. These early parks were strange hybrids. Part carnival science fair, part spectacle. One of the most iconic of these early parks was Coney Island, which exploded in popularity during the early 1900s. It wasn't just one park, it was several, including Luna Park, Dreamland, and Steeplechase Park. They competed aggressively to outdo one another with increasingly daring attractions. There were human zoos, where visitors could gawk at people from colonized nations, as well as fireproof buildings that were deliberately set on fire daily to show off firefighting technology. In Dreamland, you could watch premature babies in incubators, real medical ward turned public exhibition. It sounds unbelievable, but in an age before modern hospitals, this was how doctors funded cutting-edge care. These displays blurred the line between science, ethics, and show business. The rides themselves were often far more dangerous than anything allowed today. Safety standards were minimal, and maintenance was often an afterthought. One of the most infamous early rides was the Loop at Coney Island. Unlike modern roller coasters that used carefully calculated G-forces, this was a brutal, bone-rattling circle of steel. Riders were whipped around in a full loop, often suffering concussions or whiplash. The ride was so rough that it was shut down after just a few years. Yet thrill-seekers still lined up, driven by curiosity and the allure of danger. Another terrifying ride was the Flip-Flap Railway, which also featured a loop but with far less attention to physics. It generated up to 12 gigaseconds of force, which is enough to knock most people out cold. B-comparison fighter pilots in training experienced about 9 gigaseconds. Engineers back then weren't trained in amusement safety. They were experimenting, often recklessly, and the human body was the test subject. Injuries were common, but in that era, danger was part of the fun. The unpredictability was the thrill. But it wasn't just rides that made early amusement parks scary, it was the entire atmosphere. The parks were often overcrowded, dimly lit, and noisy beyond belief. Loud steam engines, clanging machinery, yelling barkers, and screaming crowds created a chaotic sensory overload. Sanitation was poor, with open food stands and questionable water quality. There were very few regulations. People got hurt, pickpocketed, or even crushed in crowds. Fires were a constant threat. In fact, Dreamland itself burned to the ground in 1911 in a massive fire that started from a light bulb exploding near the Hellgate attraction. The irony was lost on no one. The freak shows of early amusement parks were another deeply unsettling element. These weren't just sideshows. They were major attractions. Audiences flocked to see people with rare physical conditions. Conjoined twins, individuals with dwarfism or gigantism, and others with physical deformities. Some were marketed as monsters, others as wonders of nature. While some performers found a livelihood and even fame in these shows, many were exploited and dehumanized. Parkgoers didn't see them as people, they were living curiosities. Over time, social attitudes began to change, and such exhibitions were increasingly seen as unethical. But for decades, they were central to the amusement park experience. In addition to human exhibits, early parks often showcased disturbing animal attractions. In 1903, Coney Island's Luna Park electrocuted An elephant named Topsy in front of a crowd. Topsy had killed a handler after years of abuse, and Edison engineers staged the execution to demonstrate the power of AC electricity, while also proving a point in the War of Currents. The event was filmed and shown in theaters. This was billed as science, justice, and entertainment all at once. Looking back, it's horrifying. Perhaps the scariest part of early amusement parks was how little oversight there was. No federal safety commissions, no ride inspections, no child protection laws. Workers were often underpaid and overworked. Ride operators drank on the job. Children wandered freely among heavy machinery, and injuries were shrugged off as part of the experience. Lawsuits were rare, and the public tolerated much higher levels of risk. You didn't go to the park expecting comfort, you went expecting chaos, a break from the ordinary, and maybe even a brush with death. Some parks even leaned into this darkness. Themed attractions weren't just whimsical, they were often terrifying. Haunted houses in the early 20th century were pitch-black mazes, where live actors would jump out at you, sometimes grabbing or hitting visitors. One early dark ride in Britain featured animatronic executions, including beheadings and torture chambers. Death was not avoided, it was part of the entertainment. One ride in Chicago simulated a train wreck using real carriages and loud explosions, while passengers watched dummies be flung across the scene. Another had guests walk across a narrow beam with nothing to hold on to, suspended above moving machinery meant to simulate lava or monsters. These parks also reflected the darker anxieties of the age. Immigration, war, race, disease, and industrialization. Many rides and exhibits played off xenophobic or racist fears, presenting caricatures of foreign cultures or using colonial themes as entertainment. The horrors weren't always physical, they were often ideological. The exotic other was a spectacle, reinforcing imperialist narratives while offering the illusion of global knowledge. These were spaces where fantasies were built, but often at someone else's expense. However, it's also important to understand the other side of the story. Despite their dangers and moral ambiguity, early amusement parks also provided some of the first spaces where working-class people, women, and children could gather for recreation. For many, this was a rare escape from harsh lives. The parks offered music, food, dancing, and the thrill of spectacle. In a world that was fast becoming mechanized and controlled, these chaotic parks offered something: primal adrenaline, unpredictability, and emotional release. As the 20th century progressed, public standards shifted. Safety became a concern. Psychology began to matter. The joy of a controlled thrill began to replace the chaos of early experimentation. Laws were passed. Engineering improved. Theme parks like Disneyland reinvented the amusement experience: sterile, clean, family-friendly, and tightly choreographed. The wild, unregulated era of early amusement parks faded into history, but their influence lingers. The DNA of modern theme parks is rooted in the terrifying, awe-inspiring, morally complicated attractions of those early days. Every loop-to-loop and haunted maze owes something to the wild showmen and fearless inventors who pushed boundaries without asking permission. They built places that shocked and thrilled, terrified and amazed spaces that revealed both the imagination and darkness of human curiosity. Today, we may laugh at the idea of being scared by a rickety wooden roller coaster or find the old attractions quaint. But to the people of the early 1900s, these parks were portals to another world equal parts wonder and nightmare. They weren't just amusement parks. They were arenas of transformation, testing the limits of the human body, ethics, and emotion. In their strange and sometimes horrifying history lies a truth. Entertainment has always danced on the edge of danger.